In today's episode, we will look at several terrifying eyewitness accounts from park rangers and campers alike in the Idaho National Parks. But before we get into the stories, be sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button for storytelling on the mysterious and supernatural every other day. Let's do it. Story 1 is brought to us by an anonymous individual. Now, they claim that this story isn't theirs, but their cousin, who has worked for years as a park ranger in the Grand Teton National Park. He isn't quite sure how to explain the sighting he had, but has confided in his cousin because he knows that his cousin is a huge cryptids and supernatural person. This story takes place in the fall of 2017. Now, his cousin and his partner patrolled the St. John's area of Grand Teton National Park for rangers going off duty. It was getting dark and they were pulling into the ranger station, and as they turned in, they noticed what they saw was a large black thing on two legs, kind of crouched down right off the road, and whatever this was ripping up pieces of a deer. His cousin and his partner began to drive cautiously because at this point they both assumed it was a huge black bear. However, once the headlights illuminated the entire backside of this animal, it was evident that whatever this was no bear. The cousin described it as very slender with jet black fur and long, spindly limbs. It wasn't crouched down or sitting on all fours as a giant bear or a dog would. It was the way a human would be crouched down on their legs. Within seconds, this thing had turned its head to look in the oncoming direction, only for them to see half of this thing's face now fully illuminated by the headlights. The cousin is very clear about this, and he reiterated to his cousin when retelling this that he swears 100% that this was no bear. This thing's features were distinctly canine in appearance. To the T, he described. It had a muzzle with pointed ears and jagged teeth. The teeth were very long and kind of hung outside the jaws, and way too many teeth for its mouth. This animal was also described as having a very deep set of eyes and an intense red color. He didn't mention anything about eye glow, etc. This creature had now turned its full attention towards the now stopped vehicle and appeared to have dropped the piece of deer it was consuming, shooting towards the tree line. One of the more disturbing details about this specific sighting was how the animal or creature used its hands as the cousin described it. It had what he could see were 4 fingers and an opposable thumb on each hand that had large claws. In fact, he went on to mention how they had resembled raccoon hands. It was using it the same way a human being would when they would eat something, say like a rib or a chicken leg. His cousin and his partner watched the whole thing unfurl right before them. It didn't drop down on all fours or charge the car. Its movements were much more calculated and on 2 legs, and its speed alone surprised both of them. The cousin also mentioned that this thing's head came above the hood of the Ranger truck when it did stand fully erect and ran. They got the impression that this thing was easily 6 foot tall, if not taller, possibly maybe 7 or 8. Now, all in all, the sighting lasted only a few seconds, and they had no time to grab any sort of photo evidence. He had clung to the idea that it was a bear for sane reasons, but the size and proportions and agility of this animal just did not make sense for that to be possible. They have both spent many time in the woods, seen many bears and other forms of animals, and have even seen animals react to vehicles. This is far from what would be expected of any bear either of them had seen. It was obvious to this cousin that this thing had reacted almost as if it knew that it had been spotted and was doing something it should not, kind of going into hiding mode. Like me, the story submitter has a hard time believing the story without actual photographic evidence, but insists that his cousin, the park ranger, is a very credible individual and thinks he truly saw something out of the ordinary that night. The entire area around the Grand Teton National Park and the surrounding state appears to be a hotbed for other dogman, supernatural, and Bigfoot activity, according to many eyewitness reports that I've personally received and read over the years. Why is this? Does it have anything to do with an ample food supply, perhaps plentiful amounts of deer, more than other places? I'll let you guys be the judge. Story 2. John is an Idaho park ranger who has been following my reporting for about a year now, he claims. And he works for the Bureau of Land Management at a remote campground in the Boise National Forest. It is one of the many campgrounds scattered throughout the forest for those who want to enjoy nature. The experience he's going to share with all of us has scared the living crap out of him and supposedly deals with a reptilian creature. This was back in 2016. He woke up this one morning in his campground to a sound that he can only describe as a dying animal, but much deeper in timbre and pitch. He's been here a while and knows the sounds of all the animals in the area, but this stuck out to him because it wasn't a sound he was used to hearing or had ever heard before. So out of curiosity, he gets out of his pickup and could tell the sound was coming from a nearby small ravine that's heavily forested with trees and brush. He grabs his flashlight and walks to the edge of the tree line since it was still relatively dark, and he thought there was possibly a deer in the area and wanted to see if he could see it or at least figure out what was going on. As he walked to the tree line, this loud scream comes from across the ravine, a scream that he can only describe as that of a woman in agony. Now immediately, the hair on the back of his neck stands straight up, and so he shines his flashlight toward the sound of the scream, and he hears the sound again, but now louder and more aggressive than before. And he could tell that whatever it was like it wanted him to know that it was in charge. It sounded human, but at the same time very throaty, and there's no way a human could have made a scream like this. I mean, not in terms of volume. He has been here for many years, and this was the only time he's ever heard anything like this. He was scared, but wasn't going to let it know that. So he's scanning his flashlight around to the trees where the screaming noise was coming from, and now he could see something big moving through the trees. And he says that you could hear the trees cracking and breaking and rustling like something big is moving through them. So he's trying to follow the movement with his light, and he could kind of make out a shape now, and that's all he could really tell. There were really no details, just the outline of something very large, what he actually thought was a very large man. And then it screamed a third time, and because it was so close, he could feel the vibration of this scream through his whole body, like a loud bass stereo. He could feel that whatever it was had actually been watching him and knew that he had seen it. And he tells me this is right when it pops out of the tree line, and he sees this thing for what it is. John knows what he saw, but doesn't want to believe it. He described it as about an 8-foot-tall, lizardly-looking thing with a very muscular build, that it had limbs like a man, but ended in clawed hands. It had this large reptilian head with these large green eyes that emitted a very subtle glow. He got a glimpse of those eyes, which scared him the most. He immediately wanted to run, but now, where this thing was positioned at and where he was positioned at was actually between him and his form of escape. And as he's watching it, he could see the snout of this thing flare up as an irritation. And he wants to explain that this thing looked like something you'd see out of a Hollywood movie, like Jurassic Park or something. This thing knew that he was there watching it and could feel that this thing was giving off a very ominous presence, like it was some sort of alpha predator that wanted him dead. It began to position itself as if ready to charge him. Now, he explains he has never been so scared in his life, and so he starts to back away from the tree line around up the ravine, deciding the best course of action was now to run as fast as possible back to the truck, not completely sure if he was actually going to make it, but he knew he had no choice. He began running back, and he could now hear it charging after him. And he could hear and see that it was running on all fours, but it sounded like a tank barreling crashing through the woods. And he's going as fast as he can, and he could hear it crashing and breaking down small saplings as it's getting closer and closer in pursuit of him. He explains like he ran like a bat out of hell, and it stayed very close. But he admits that even though it easily had the power to get up to him, it stayed its distance. And he could feel the ground shaking as this thing closed in on him, but still kept distance. As he was running for his life and knew he wanted to stop, he couldn't. At one point, it seemed to veer off in the brush. His mind immediately went to the idea that it was planning on flanking him, and he knew he had to move faster, just a little more. and he can now hear it screaming and crashing even louder. Now it was within 10 feet behind him in the brush, and he knew it either was going to grab him or wait for him to come out of the clearing and flank him. And this is right when he finally made it to his truck. He doesn't even have time to close the door. He just jumps in, turns on the car, and floors it, because this thing is right there on him. And it actually leapt up from the ground and jumped nearly into the bed of the truck, its claws scraping along the side. He guns it, and it rolls off the back of the truck into a small ravine right near the road. I guess it was more a gully. And he was so scared now he doesn't know what to do. His hands are shaking and he's breathing like crazy. This thing leaps up from the gully or the ravine and is now keeping parallel on all fours with the truck at about 40 miles an hour down this old road. And he could see that it's actually trying to make its way up to the driver's side door. It keeps looking at him, looking down at the door, looking up at him, looking down at the door, as if this thing is intelligent enough to be plotting to rip open the door and pull him out and devour him whole. And John knows that if he did not get away from this thing, he would not be alive to tell the story. And he is flooring it, going 55 miles an hour, just pushing the truck as hard as he could. And he could see now that it was trying to leap up and actually grab at the door handle. But he was fortunate enough to be able to be swerving like an extremely drunk driver in hopes of deterring it. And once he had made it onto one of the paved roads right before, this thing leaps into the trees and disappears. Now he's scared and terrified. He didn't know what to do. What could he possibly tell anyone that they would believe him? He didn't know what to do. He calls up his supervisor once he's able to calm down and get back to a place where he can make the call, and the supervisor just tells him to go home. He tells him that he would have fill-in work for him since he was too shaken up. Now over the next few days, he could still feel the fear, but also anger mixed with anxiety of just knowing what can exist out there, but there is something that he has never seen and claims it was no Bigfoot and it was not a bear. John also wanted to mention that for the record, he did not tell his boss that he saw a flipping Jurassic Park monster, that what he saw was a large black bear that had tried to attack him, which his boss found strange due to how scared and how he described the encounter. But John knew deep down that he couldn't tell his boss what had happened. He would think John was a nut. And he was off work for 3 days or so after that, and it took a long while to not have serious anxiety attacks or the fear that something was always watching him. He did his best to do what they always say: ignore it the best you can and move on with life. But there are just simply some things you can never move on from. That was 6 years ago now, and John's still not exactly sure what he saw because it was all too real and hard for his brain to process, but understands and accepts that it was something that defies our modern reality. What do you guys think of John's story? Our third story comes from an ex-park ranger who had worked extensively with the Parks and Recreation for 8 years back in the 1980s. And has 2 really crazy stories to share with us. Here's the first. Years ago, in the early 80s in Idaho, they had a section where there was a lot of forest fires going on. And at the time, this anonymous individual was on a fire crew in the Salmon National Forest. They got the call at around 1 a.m. that there was a fire burning about 5 miles from their location. They were the first crew to be called in, and they had to drive about 15 miles with their trucks and other equipment to get to the fire. They get there and they're doing the work, and other fire crews were out working on it. Luckily, it was a minor fire, so they didn't have to stay very long. Fortunately, the fires were easily tamed and they did not have to stay there that long. Now, very shortly, he talks about seeing something coming out of the tree line in a blinding flash of light and zooming upwards towards the sky. In fact, it took all of them by surprise and shocked them. They yelled at the top of their lungs, "Did you see that? What was that?" Looking at each other, wondering what they saw. All they knew was that they were in a state of shock because of how blindingly bright the light was. Some of the men are even convinced they just saw an alien craft take off. They all said they saw the same thing, corroborating the exact same details. They could not believe what they had seen, and they all stood there and watched this yellow light ascend up higher into the sky, fading into a blue and then a red. Once it was out of sight, they looked back and forth at each other and knew what it was. They could not ignore the fact that they had all seen a UFO. They didn't know at first, but they all knew it was not from this planet, as this anonymous individual describes. They were all Forest Service employees, all trained as professionals, and learned that anything abnormal is not really spoken publicly. They all knew what they saw, and it was the first time in their lives, he explains that, and for the first time in all of their lives, they all saw actual aerial proof that there was an extraterrestrial craft that was either coming or going out of the tree line. Fast forward a few hours later, as the early morning hours are setting in, and again, this anonymous individual sees this large, dark shape sitting in the night sky. This one was slightly different in color compared to the night sky around it, so there was a contrast which allowed you to see it. He describes it as looking like a large gray orb, but that it was just levitating in the sky. It was about the size of perhaps a large passenger plane, but looked like an orb. It was dark gray, but almost had a slight shimmer to it, and was kind of just sitting there in the sky. And again, he corroborates with the other rangers, and they're all saying the same thing as before. So now they'd just seen the blinding flashlight only a few hours before, and now this strange orb in the night sky. At this point, they're all just continually in a state of shock and awe. They were the only ones that saw this thing, apparently, because the rest of the crews out there with them didn't see anything. They're very aware that at this time, there was no planes that looked like that and could or could not have been a government craft. A couple of the guys, along with this individual who submitted the story, described seeing a similar craft in the sky 2 days previously back home. That they witnessed the same orb described as I just did, similar in color and size with an identical shimmer, but appeared to be smaller and zooming through the sky quickly. It's written that this experience alone made most of them believers really quickly. Other strange things have also been happening all around the National Forest during this person's tenure there. One night, while out on a call, they were driving their truck and had their high beams on, and as they were driving down this road, these large orbs of light were coming out from the tree line and almost going onto the road. They had to swerve their truck to avoid hitting these because at first they assumed it was maybe a biker or somebody with a headlamp on, and going around 45 to 50 miles an hour, you have to be careful. But these lights kind of just floated and bounced onto the road before just vanishing. They thought not only was it incredibly strange, but after quickly swerving to get out of the way, they got out of their vehicle to go investigate, only to find zero tracks or trace of anyone, but noted that the air felt full of electricity. They distinctly remember hearing this low buzzing or humming sound, and that they still have no way to explain that. Okay, now for the second story. This next one was in 1986, and this person was busy clearing out a large piece of brush on one of the back roads due to a large storm that had just blew through the area a few days prior. They were short-staffed this particular season and had to pick up extra hours and duties. It was about noon, and they had been working with the crew of about 3 other guys for just a few hours. They were all sitting on the tailgate of the truck eating lunch when all of them see this large blackbird about 2 times larger than a condor flying low overhead over them. In fact, it was flying so low that they thought it might actually hit the tips of the trees, but it flew straight, then turned sharply to the left and disappeared. They all looked at each other in disbelief and asked, "Did you see that?" They all said yes, but could not explain what it was. It was a large blackbird. Neither of them had ever seen a bird of this size. It was simply gargantuan. I mean, we're talking about a wingspan of maybe 15 to 20 feet easily, and yes, those estimates are correct, judging by how low it was flying and the fact that all 3 of these eyewitnesses saw it. After it disappeared, the sounds around them seemed to stop entirely and come to a halt, as if everything in the forest had now been holding its breath. Still can't explain that either. They're all just in a complete state of shock. They never saw anything like that before or after that day. The eyewitness of this story felt a little more open sharing this particular sighting, unlike the UFO one. A few people had the chance to speak about it, told him something exciting. They had mentioned to him what some people refer to as a thunderbird. Now, he's not exactly sure what a thunderbird is, but if it's at all what they had saw that day, he would like to not run into it face to face. Some of the other guys that were with him during this time also had some interesting stories, ones that they will never tell anyone publicly. One in particular was a great guy, and they'll call him Joe. Joe told our eyewitness about this one time when he was out on a call by himself and had to check this waterline break, also a park ranger. He said it was getting dark and wanted to get this fixed before heading back. He said he pulled up to the area and got out to assess anything, but as he walked over, he heard what sounded like metal scraping behind him. When he turned around, he could see a large shape of something moving, and he said that whatever it was stopped moving when he turned around and looked. Joe, being the tough guy, decided to walk in the direction of the noise to see what it was. But when he took a couple steps to get closer, he said that whatever it was just took off running into the woods. And Joe told our eyewitness that whatever it was very quick, 8 feet tall easily, and covered in hair. And it left a horrible stench behind like rotting eggs and roadkill, and cleared a small gully about 12 feet across like it was nothing. He said that from what he could tell, as it moved, it looked like a giant ape, but he couldn't know for sure. So our eyewitness had asked him if he ever saw it again, and he said no, but now and again he would feel like something was watching him when out in the woods. He described it as this uneasiness you just can't shake. He did have a different experience, though, when he was out with a group of guys going through the outback. He wasn't on the clock this time. In fact, it was his own personal time. And he said he started to feel that same uneasiness again, like something was watching him. On this particular event, this was just after the one I just told you about, so maybe by 2 or 3 months. And Joe said he got up to take a leak, and when he came back, he could have sworn that what he thought was a large tree by where he was sitting was now gone, and that what he thought was a large tree was actually a Bigfoot that had shifted and moved within the darkness. And within 10 minutes, that awful rotten egg smell crept up into their campsite. And after that, they decided to hightail it out of there for that evening. He tells the eyewitness that the guys he was with weren't Bigfoot believers at all or anything, but you could feel the tension in the air that something just wasn't right. They all agreed they didn't feel safe. Now that this eyewitness is retired, he reflects on all this and wonders what exists in the woods that we all can't explain. That he's read many stories of people encountering some pretty strange things in the woods, and it really makes you think. He's a believer now, whereas before he was not. Joe has since passed away, but we will all never forget his stories, and the look on his face as he told them. He describes Joe as being a man of few words, but when he did speak, you knew he wasn't lying or making up stories. That he spoke it as the truth, and coupled with his own experiences that he has shared and the experience of other guys who never wanted to come forward about it, things are going on in the national parks that we don't know about. But more importantly, what do you guys think? Are these stories merely a work of fiction? Or are they the repressed tales of men and women on the forest fronts forced to keep quiet about these experiences? I'd love to know what you think down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to smack that like button. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit the subscribe button for more storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural every other day. As always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys in the next video.